Hi, everyone. It's Dr. Sheftal again with Truth in Science. Tonight's video is going to center on the testimony yesterday in the Officer Chauvin murder trial. And I'm going to point out some errors that were made by the pulmonologist, even though he was lauded greatly by the pundits on television as having given this flawless testimony that was airtight. In particular, I want to point out some places where the defense attorney, who generally has done pretty well, speaking from a total layman here, I'm not a lawyer, it seemed like he was making good points along the way. But then last night, when he had the chance to cross-examine the pulmonologist, he just asked 3 or 4 questions and said, that's all the questions I have. And I'm thinking, wow, that's amazing. Because I found at least a dozen major flaws and mistakes that the pulmonologist made that you would think he would have asked about. So let's get started and see what you guys think of this. You can comment you can make comments below. However, unfortunately, I've been shadow banned. And the last video that I did, which was about the Chauvin trial, has only gotten 200 views so far. And normally by now I would have had 5,000 views at least, maybe 7. And so they're obviously blocking me. And they're also blocking my, my thumbs up also. Sometimes my thumbs up goes up and then it goes down. It's happened 5 or 6 times on that particular video. So I don't know what's going on. I'm definitely getting blocked in some way, but I'll keep trying to do what I think is important for people to know, as long as I feel like I'm sharing good information. Okay, so let's get started. This is the bona fides page, and we'll skip it for sure, like we always do, but just take note that I taught physics at a university, a major university, and also was a physics major and so forth, because there's a little bit of physics that's involved in this. Not too much, though, very simple, more like high school physics. All right, so the title of this slide is What Happened to the Defense Attorney in the Chauvin Trial? And I'm gonna list some mistakes that I noticed immediately from the pulmonologist, mistakes of fact, mistakes or errors in reasoning, and also suggested questions that you would think the defense attorney would have definitely asked the pulmonologist, which arise from the errors that he made. So let me go ahead now. OC stands for Officer Chauvin, and GF stands for George Floyd. Okay, Officer Chauvin's right knee was not, quote, on George Floyd's right arm and chest, as the pulmonologist said. I looked at all the pictures that he did in his presentation. I looked at his presentation today, the first hour and a half of it, and I came up with all these errors. And I've got 2 more hours to find many, many, many more errors if people are interested. But even in the first hour and a half, it's just, I found 20 slides worth. So let me continue on. So his right knee was not on George Floyd's right arm and chest. It was by the right arm on the street. And that's his illustration that shows that. And the photographs, the stop action pictures from the video. Here's another thing that's very interesting from the illustration. The one that was used at testimony was not accurate at all. It shows the 3 officers larger than Mr. Floyd in the chest, when in fact they were all much, much smaller than Mr. Floyd. So let me show you that picture. And here it is. And this is in the pulmonologist's testimony to demonstrate what was going on there. I made sure to leave a white border there so that people wouldn't think that I had cropped off part of the picture for some reason to make Mr. Floyd look smaller. But you will see in a second the ratio, even between the size of Mr. Floyd's arm and the thighs of the police officers. Now, here is Officer Chauvin here, and then the other 2 officers. And you can see that Officer Chauvin's left knee is on the neck of left knee or shin. You can't tell because his shoulder's in the way, but it's up there on his neck somewhere, okay? We'll get to more details on that later. This officer here is straddling Mr. Floyd and holding his left wrist, which is a very important part of this presentation, which I'll explain to you in just a minute. A lot of crazy conclusions were drawn by the pulmonologist about that made no sense. But note that the officer is holding the left wrist right by the belt line, probably an inch or 2 inches, let's say, from the belt line, from where his belt is. And I'll show you that in a real life picture too, but just remember that, because I'm going to show you where the chest is. This just has no effect on the chest whatsoever. Okay, and look at how big this officer looks compared to Mr. Floyd, who looks very small in this picture. So already you know that they're trying to pull a fast one when they make a drawing like this. But do note that the right thigh of Chauvin, Officer Chauvin, and knee is not on top of Mr. Floyd. It's back further. It's even further back than the left thigh of this officer. But you need to take these things into consideration because they're all going to be very important in just a minute, because we're talking about how much pressure was on his back and neck and so forth. Now, here's a real life picture of Mr. Floyd, who was in phenomenal shape. I mean, what a specimen Mr. Floyd is. Look at the size of his deltoid and shoulder. Look at his triceps and biceps. Look how big his arm is across. Just look at how great this distance is across. It's bigger than the thigh of the guy that was back on his feet. Here's the outline of his right thigh. That's the front of it there. This part over here is his left thigh. But I can see slightly lighter blue here. That's his right thigh. The distance from here to here, the maximum distance of his thigh, is smaller than Mr. Floyd's arm. Okay, from his tricep there to his bicep. That's bigger than his thigh. That's how much bigger Mr. Floyd is than these guys. And just look at his chest and how small his waist is. Mr. Floyd was in phenomenal shape. I mean, he looks like he was 6'4" and weighed 232 pounds, and he was just in flawless condition, shape, wasn't he? I mean, super handsome guy. All right. And you know, the police officers are no slouches either. They go through basically boot camp to get in good shape. But there's just no comparison between Mr. Floyd and these two officers here. They're way smaller than he is. All right, let me continue on. But when you look at this, and then you go back to this picture, I mean, it's just absurd. Look how tiny he looks there. Look at his arm there. His arm in real life was bigger than this guy's thighs, bigger, right? This width across here is bigger than this thigh. It's bigger. I measured it, it's bigger. And then over, excuse me. So what did I do there? Yeah, but over here, here's his arm, and here's this guy's thigh. This thigh is way bigger than this arm. So they just reversed it. Just horrible to try to mislead people like that. All right. Here's another picture showing the tremendous shape that Mr. Floyd is in and how he just towers over these small guys here. Even here, when his arm is in a very awkward position, this officer is trying to hold his arm with his hand, and you can't see fingers on either side of his arm there. That's how big his arm is. You follow me? They can't even get their fingers around his arm. It's so big. And again, the distance from here to here is bigger than this officer's thigh. Isn't that amazing? This is bigger than his thigh, not his arm. Okay. But look at Mr. Floyd in the musculature in his back for a second. This is his trapezius, the muscle I was talking about in the last video. The sternocleidomastoid runs right there. You can see the shadow of it right there. Look at the size of his deltoid, his triceps here. This is his latissimus dorsi muscle right here. I mean, he's just in phenomenal shape. His whole chest and shoulder girdle, which spans from here to here, fans out from a very small, fit waist. The guy was in phenomenal shape. Now, let's continue on with the mistakes of fact. I've already explained fact 1 and fact 2 that were totally wrong as stated by the pulmonologist. Let's continue on now. He then said something that was really strange. He said, whether the right knee is on the chest or rammed in against the chest, the effects are extremely similar. Now that strikes me as shocking, because you're talking about Officer Chauvin's right thigh being pushed against the side of Mr. Floyd. And he's saying whether it's on the chest or just rammed in against the side of the chest, the effects are extremely similar. And this entire case is about putting his knee on the neck. Is he saying that if Officer Chauvin had just pushed his thigh up against Mr. Floyd's neck, it would have been the same as putting it on top of his neck? That's what he says about the right knee. Unbelievable, just ridiculous. All right. Okay, I just wanted to point out that it's not just the diaphragm, the intercostal muscles, and the sternocleidomastoid muscles that increase chest volume that you use to breathe with. There's also a thing called abdominal breathing, and it's what a lot of people do. Feel your own belly when you take a breath, okay? Some people use mostly thorax. Women tend to use more thorax, and men tend to use their stomach more than when they breathe. But that's another very important mechanism for breathing, for changing the volume in the chest. And I'll talk about the physics of that in just a minute. Okay, now this turned out to be a really silly, almost silly thing, but I'm gonna talk about it, attack it scientifically so that people really understand this. He said, believe it or not, that the right knee braced against the left chest, right? Officer Chauvin's right knee pushed in really hard against the left chest, and the handcuffs, the left wrist being pushed down about 2 inches above the belt line, which is way below the chest, was equivalent to a surgeon surgically removing the left lung. That's what the pulmonologist said. And the defense attorney did not call him out on that. It's just incredible. It's just ridiculous to say something like that. In other words, he's trying to say that no air could get into the left lung because his leg was braced up against it. His right thigh, Officer Chauvin's right thigh was braced up against the chest, and one of the other officers was pushing down on his left wrist right above the belt, 2 inches above the belt. Okay, now let me just give you a little bit of an anatomy lesson, because this is really gonna help you understand things. It's kind of like the virology primers I gave you before, except that, well, it's very similar to that. Let's leave it at that for now. Okay, if you count the ribs down, here's rib 1, rib 2, rib 3, and rib 4, okay? Then you have the dome of the diaphragm here. So the lung is on top of the dome of the diaphragm primarily, except a little bit of lung hangs over the edge of the diaphragm here, because the diaphragm is a domed shape structure that goes up into the lung a little bit. In other words, the bottom surface of the lung is not flat. It has a concave shape to it where the dome of the diaphragm fits. Now, right under that diaphragm is the liver. It's part of the abdominal contents. So the abdominal contents come almost up to T4, we call it. That's the fourth vertebrae in the thorax, okay? Now, do you know what the surface anatomy is for T4 in a man? It's the nipple. There's the nipple on this drawing. Ooh, that's a better drawing. Let me go back to the other slide for a second, and I'll explain it all on that slide because the picture's bigger. But if the man's skin and so forth was on top of this skeleton, his nipple would be about right here, okay? His nipple. So here's where the nipple is. I can almost fit it in my video here of me. That's as far down. I mean, the diaphragm goes up to there in a person. It's hard to believe that it goes up that high. Everybody thinks it's way down by your belly, but it's not. And I'll tell you, when I was a general surgery resident, an intern, and then a general surgery resident, and then an attending in Mississippi, in all three instances, one of the interns when I was in California did it. One of the lower level residents did it when I was a chief resident up north in Cleveland. And another attending did this in Mississippi. They were putting a chest tube in to drain blood out of the lung here, which we do all the time. Sometimes it's air, sometimes it's blood. It's usually blood. And because it's so hard to believe that the diaphragm and the liver go up that high, people frequently will stick the chest tube in about right here. Let's see, that's 4, 5, 6, 7. They'll stick it in maybe between 7 and 8, ribs 7 and 8, and they'll stick it right into the liver. They'll stick the chest tube right into the liver. And I'll tell you, you don't want to be sticking anything that's big like a chest tube into the liver. It bleeds like crazy. There was a big lawsuit in Mississippi because a pulmonologist tried to do this surgical procedure. And he regretted it bitterly, I'm sure, because he got sued over it. It was a major problem. Now, and I, went in there and took it out and stopped the bleeding and all that for him. But let me tell you, it was not a pretty picture. Now, so just bear that in mind when we're looking at where the chest actually is, where the lungs are. Okay, when I show you some more pictures later. By the way, here's the esophagus here, and the stomach is right under this side, this dome. The left side, which is to the right in our picture, is lower than the right side. The diaphragm is not symmetrical across the midline. You see it's higher here than it is here. And this is where the stomach goes, right here, okay? So the liver's here, the stomach is here. So the duodenum, the beginning of the small intestine, comes right in here and fills up this area. The gallbladder is right here, taking the cystic duct, or feeding its cystic duct into the common bile duct, which is formed from the right and left hepatic ducts coming out of the liver. And then the common bile duct swings around the duodenum and dumps into the duodenum after it combines with the pancreatic duct, which is behind the stomach, right at the sphincter of Oddi in the duodenum. Right there is where all that happens. Okay, so this is real abdominal stuff going on here. So when we talk about where that left rib was on the back, it's way down here. All right, I'll talk about that in a second. Oops, sorry. What? Okay. Now let me just look at this for a second. This is a very accurate drawing of a man. This is his nipple. So that's at T4 right there. Right there is T4. And you can see the lung goes a little bit below T4. It goes down into around T5 or so, down here, T6 maybe. Because again, a little bit of it hangs over the diaphragm. The diaphragm goes up in that concave area all the way up to there, okay? Inside of the lung, basically, all right? So just bear in mind all this. It's very important. You can see that the heart is, where's my pointer? The heart is slightly displaced to the left of the patient. That's why we put our hand over our left chest here when we say Pledge of Allegiance or something, okay? All right, now, so that's a pretty good lesson on the thorax there. By the way, the top parts of the lung go above the clavicles, as you can see here. They go up into this area right here, okay? Pretty important. Let me continue on now. Now, everyone agrees, for the most part, now that it's been beat into them with the pictures and the video, that the knee shin was pretty much at this level right here, okay? This is the thyroid cartilage here, and the pulmonologist was talking about the hypopharynx, which is, remember he was saying it was superior to the thyroid cartilage, that you couldn't break the thyroid cartilage. So it's really right about, and he's correct, it's behind the chin here, straight in from where the chin is. And I'll tell you, you can't compress something this far away by putting pressure down here. Now you might say, well, the knee is a really big thing, right? It's really big, it covers everything. Well, if that's the case, then it can't put very much pressure on the neck because force equals pressure times area. Think about this for a second. what's important is the pressure that you're putting on something. So if I take a screwdriver and I push on it with 10 pounds of weight into your arm, it really hurts. You know, it pushes in with a very strong, painful push, okay? But if I take that same 10 pounds of pressure and I use my entire palm to push on your arm, it hardly hurts at all, right? Even if my palm was made out of the same metal that the screwdriver is, it wouldn't matter. You're spreading the force over a very large area. So just look at the equation here. If you take the force and let the force be constant, whether I'm pushing with a screwdriver or the palm of my hand, and pretend I've got a metal glove on if you want. If you divide the force by the area, the smaller the area, because it'll be in the denominator over here, the smaller the denominator is, the larger the quotient is. So the larger the pressure is. Do you understand that? It's the pressure that matters, not the force. Okay. All right, so let's go on to the next picture now. Oh, by the way, this is the trapezius here that I talked about in the last video, which is very important in this discussion. And this is the sternocleidomastoid here that both myself and the pulmonologist have referred to a few times. And there's the trachea coming down with the rings on it, okay? And here's the ascending aorta, transverse, and descending aortas, and so forth. Here's the superior vena cava, and the inferior vena cava goes right through the diaphragm, right here, and goes into the right atrium. All right. So let's look at this for a second. Here is the pharynx. Here's the thyroid cartilage that the pulmonologist said you can't break, it's too strong. He said the hypopharynx is above that, which is correct. So here's the hypopharynx. Hypo means below, okay? Like hypoxia means low oxygen. But here's the hypopharynx right here. And here's the skin of the back of the neck. So think about this for a second. Now, he didn't push directly on the back of his neck straight down, okay, with his head facing the concrete, except for a little tiny bit. He turned his head, as you'll remember from the video, to the side. So pretend that his head is turned to the side here and his shoulders are coming across here. Mr. Floyd now I'm talking about. You cannot compress this hypopharynx by pushing down into the page right here. There's too many structures in the way. Push on your own neck there. I don't care how hard you push. You can't do anything to a little tube that's in the front of the throat here. Just push on your own neck. You think about it. There's no way you could compress something in here. And I'll talk about the structures you have to go through to compress it in a later slide. So this is just an error of logic, okay? Let me continue on now. It'll be crystal clear later. Okay, we're listing the errors of logic now. We've been through the errors of the factual errors, okay. The whole handcuff right knee thing is completely illogical. And I'm going to show you that with lots of detailed pictures in just a second. The respiratory rate reasoning was flawed. Remember he was talking about getting the respiratory rate. It was only 22. He measured it. And he said, well, he couldn't have had any fentanyl on board because fentanyl is a respiratory depressant. It slows your respiratory rate. And I'm thinking, I know, but he's been fighting with 3 men for 5 minutes. And I don't know if you remember getting in a fight in junior high or something, and the teacher breaks it up and you're trying to explain who's at fault, and you're going, you know, while you're trying to explain whose fault it was that started the fight. When you're in a fight like that, all juiced up, your respiratory rate goes way up. So the fact that it was only 22, which is in the normal range, means that something had to bring it way down from what it would be during a struggle, okay? It would be up above 45, might be 60. You might be breathing once a second, okay? So the fact that it was 22 kind of proves that there was a lot of fentanyl on board. That means something brought it all the way down to the normal range. You wouldn't expect it to be in the normal range if you're fighting with 3 other people over going to jail. God, okay. So that was all messed up. That respiratory rate explanation made no sense. He just forgot that the guy's respiratory rate would have been super high just from all the struggling he was doing. Okay. Now, The CO2 level explanation also was flawed. Remember, he said that the venous CO2 is 89, the venous blood gas, and the arterial, I'm sorry, the arterial blood gas is 89 and the venous blood gas is 102. But he said, you got to go by the arterial blood gas. Okay, fine. So it's 89. And he said, normally it's 35 to 45. Fine, that's about 40. So it was 49 off, okay? And he said, well, you lose 4 for every minute. And there were 9 minutes going on there. So, you know, raise it up to what's 9 times 4, 36. 36 plus 45 is 91. Excuse me, I did that wrong. 45 plus 36 is 81. So it's in the range of 89, okay? He was trying to make that kind of explanation. But he forgot that they did CPR in the ambulance from the parking lot all the way to the hospital. And when you do CPR, you blow off CO2. Okay, you add oxygen and you blow off CO2. That's the whole point of doing CPR. Remember, the air goes into the lungs, into the alveoli, and the oxygen concentration in the air is greater than in the venous blood. So that makes the partial pressure of O2 push the oxygen across the interface between the alveolus and the capillaries so that some of the oxygen will attach to hemoglobin on the other side. And the partial pressure of CO2 is higher in the venous blood than in the inhaled air. So CO2 goes into the alveolus in the other direction. And then when you exhale, the CO2 goes out. So when you're resuscitating someone with CPR, you're reducing their CO2 and you're increasing their O2. That's the whole point of it. All right. By the way, let me just very quickly, he also did not explain how people, the way the air moves very well. When you increase the volume of your chest with the muscles that he talked about, which were correct, the intercostals and the diaphragm, with the diaphragm doing about 70% and the intercostals about 30%, and the other things fairly negligible. The reason that the air goes in, it's kind of a layman's way to explain it by saying it sucks it in, or it's a vacuum. I think he said it's a vacuum-like process. It's much simpler than that. When you take a certain volume and you increase the volume, the pressure goes down because there's the same number of molecules in there and they are inside and they bump into each other less often. So there's less pressure in there, to the point where the pressure inside the chest is lower than, say, atmospheric pressure out here. That's why the air goes in when the volume of your chest increases, because the air is always going to go down a pressure gradient. And then when you want to blow it out, the volume of your chest gets smaller. That makes the molecules bump into each other more often, which means the pressure is higher to the point that it's higher than atmospheric pressure. And that's why the air goes out when you exhale, okay? It's always going to go down a pressure gradient, be it in or out, okay? Now, here is the handcuff thing. And we just got to go over this a little bit to explain it so that you really understand this. Here is Mr. Floyd right here. Here is his belt line, somewhere in here, okay? This is way below his nipple. Remember we talked about the nipple being where the abdominal contents start. Believe it or not, his stomach is about right here and his liver is right there, okay? There's his nipple right there. His belt is way down here on a young man like him in that kind of shape. The belt is depicted right here in the picture. You can see the belt. See it? Right there. There is his palm, the officer's palm. Very close. I would say at the most that's 2 inches. I mean, the distance from the belt to the palm is shorter than the distance across the palm. And look at your own palm. It's about 2.5 inches across, maybe 3, if you have real big hands. So he's only 2 inches from his belt, and his belt is way down on his hips, way down on his hip bone, or even lower. And the pulmonologist thinks this pressure right here is affecting his ability to breathe when it's way, way down here somewhere. When thorax doesn't even start till you get up here. It's like 1.5 feet lower, or at least a foot, excuse me. Okay, do you see the problem with the logic here? It's like he's trying to pull one over on everybody. It's really amazing that he's that far off. So he's up here somewhere. You know, remember he talked about them having to pull the hand up. He's up here somewhere, and his arms would bend like crazy when you bring it up here on the back of his thing. See, he's handcuffed already here. You move that up a little bit into this area, you know, above his belt, but not much higher than that. And pull it way over to the other side. Remember, he's pulled way over to his right side here. That's why the arms are bent so much. I mean, and he's pushing it into his back, pretty much in the middle of his back. Remember, he does not have a big waist. He doesn't have a big belly. That's close to the middle of his back. And I'll tell you, reach around your own back now and push in as hard as you can, you know, a couple inches, 3 inches above your belt line. You can't move it in 1 millimeter. I don't care how hard you push. You cannot push in on the paraspinous muscles or the spine itself and get anywhere. It doesn't affect your breathing at all. Okay? Not in the slightest. And he was trying to say that putting his leg next to Mr. Floyd's chest when he was laying on his stomach, just next to his chest, real snug though. I'll admit it was probably real tight in there. He pushed it in there. That and this other officer pushing down into his paraspinal muscles and his spine was equivalent to a surgeon removing the left lung. I mean, that's just the most bizarre thing I've ever heard in 33 years of being a surgeon. It really is. That was amazing. All right. He also added that it's also preventing him from expanding the right side of his chest. So he ruled out the left side of his chest by saying it's the same as if a surgeon cut the whole lung out. So then he goes over there and says it's actually impinging on his right side, preventing him from expanding the right side. And here's a close-up of it right here. Here's the belt. See the shiny part of the belt there, the leather belt? You can see the shiny part right there too, but here's the leather belt. Here's right literally where the butt of that yellow arrow is. Here's his hand. And also, we don't know how hard he's pushing down with his hand. We know he's squeezing the wrist really hard, but we don't know how hard he's pushing down. It looks kind of vertical, like he might be pushing down on it, and maybe he is. But I'm telling you, you can't move, you can't push your back in 2 millimeters in the back. You just cannot do it. It's rock solid, even on me, and I'm an old guy. And I'm not in anywhere near the shape that George Floyd is in. Oh my God, it's laughable to even compare it. But you can't push it in on me either. Okay, it's just the whole thing just makes no sense at all. Here I'm talking about the paraspinal muscles and the spine back there. You can't push them in 1 millimeter. So you can't push his wrist into his back there and impede his breathing. Boy. Again, we have no idea how hard they're pushing down. And the back doesn't move. The back, okay, this is important. When you put your hand behind your back and you take a breath, remember you talked about the bucket and the other kind of pump handle, the pump handle and the bucket. When you put your hand behind your back and you against the surface and you take breaths, you can feel your chest moving around here and certainly out to the sides and a little bit in front. But it doesn't move much backwards. It doesn't. Yeah, simple, basic stuff. All right. All right, now here's another thing that just, good Lord. It was amazing to hear him say it. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. And again, he said, you can see his left hand being rammed into his back right there. And you don't know how hard they're pushing. This looks like he's just got a couple fingertips down. There's no way he's going to be able to breathe with that. I'm quoting the pulmonologist now. He's trying to breathe with his fingers and his knuckles. He actually said that. And what he meant was, he's got his fingertip down there touching the pavement, and he's got a knuckle pushing into the tire here. And the pulmonologist is saying that he's trying to breathe with his knuckle and his fingertip there. Because this officer is pushing down on his wrist and Chauvin has his right thigh pushed in against the side of his abdomen or his thorax. I don't know. I have to see the knee a little better. I don't know where he's pushing in. He'd have to have it way up under his arm, in his armpit, basically, to be touching his thorax, though. Okay. But you see my point, though? And if you look at that illustration from the very beginning, he's not touching the guy's thorax or body. He's way back. You know, I could flip back to see it, but I think you remember that. You certainly can go back and look at it on the video. I'm taking for granted that the pulmonologist was accurate about that, but the picture sure doesn't depict that. But anyway, it's silliness to talk about breathing with a fingertip here, trying to push your whole body up with one fingertip. Nobody can do that. Or a knuckle against a tire here. I mean, come on, it's just unbelievable. Utter nonsense. Now, let me just say one more thing about the way people are shaped. Because if you're on your chest and you are trying to manipulate yourself so you can breathe easier, if you draw a person from above, you'll find that you draw the head in, and then you draw almost a straight line for the back, almost. And then the front, you don't draw a straight line. We're not rectangles looking down on us. We're straight in the back. Then we have our arms that come here, pretty square. But then we have a curved, our front of our body is curved. It's not like our back where it kind of goes shoots straight across, okay? Pretty much, not exactly. That's why when you look at a woman's breast, they point out to the side slightly. They don't point straight ahead like headlights because our chests are curved and her breasts are paired structures about the midline. So they're gonna both be pointing out slightly this way. Do you understand? Because we're curved in front. We're not straight in front. So when you're laying on your stomach and you're trying to breathe, if something really was pushing on your chest and you wanted to roll to your side, okay, then someone pushing on this side of your chest would actually help you roll that way. In other words, if you're curved, let me look for something that's curved. Yeah, okay. For lack of a better thing to show you, gosh. Here's your back, here's your front. This is way exaggerated. But if you want to raise this side, pushing down on this side helps. So the officers were helping him roll that way. It just makes no sense what he said. Okay. Because we're curved in the front, you see? All right. Now, I pointed out that I was surprised that the defense attorney didn't ask some obvious questions. But he needed to ask the pulmonologist, how do people die of a fentanyl overdose? What do they die of? And he would have gotten an answer that their breathing gets slower and slower and then it stops, okay? Sometimes patients will actually fall asleep and stop breathing while they're asleep, okay? From the fentanyl. It'll depress their respiration so much that it stops. Very scary. All right. Why did George Floyd have shortness of breath before he was taken down? If your whole point about the shortness of breath, and he made the big deal about he said, certainly it's true that if you can speak, you're breathing, which absolutely is true. You got to move air through the larynx to make noise. And I said, the only thing you can do when you can't breathe is you can squeak out one more word from the residual volume that's in there after you exhale. There's always a little bit of air in the lungs that you could push out and go, one more time like that. And then the people on TV immediately misquoted him. They immediately said he contradicted the fact that if you're breathing, that if you're speaking, you can breathe. He didn't do that. He agreed with that statement that if you're speaking, you can breathe. So they misquoted him immediately. All right, but anyway, why did George Floyd have shortness of breath before he was taken down? Because all of the pulmonologist's argument rests on him being short of breath, even though he was talking, and not being able to breathe very well, even though he was talking. He was saying that he had very shallow respirations, even though his chest was going up and down. Okay, all right. The defense also needed to ask, many times Officer Chauvin was not vertical above where he was putting the pressure like they showed in the picture in the testimony. He was leaning way over to the right. And I'm saying, can you go over the forces involved in that position using vectors so that we can figure out exactly how much weight was on his neck? It was a lot less. And I know that from vector addition. I won't get into the mathematics of it, but believe me, when Chauvin was leaning way to the right, most of the weight, remember the weight is from your center of mass straight down. His center of mass wasn't even over the neck anymore. So it would have been just a little bit of pressure on the neck. All right. And he was to the right quite a bit in the video. All right. Okay. How did the hypopharynx, remember he kept talking about the hypopharynx getting compressed. It was the size of a dime and all this kind of stuff. How did the hypopharynx get compressed through the nuchal ligament? And reach back there yourself and push on it. It's rock hard. The spinous processes of the spine. Okay, rock hard. The spinal cord, I'm going right down through the structures now. The spinal cord is surrounded by spinal fluid, so it's real soft, right? It's bony, but we're talking about compressing something. I mean, if the bone doesn't get pushed, forget it about compressing something further down the road. Everything has to be pushed a little bit to compress something way down at the end. And if you have something soft in between, like the esophagus, that's going to take all the compression and it's not going to compress the trachea. Okay? The esophagus is a totally soft piece in there. That's where the food goes. It's behind, here's my trachea right here. The esophagus is behind it, okay? And if somebody's pushing on my neck back here, they're going to have to compress the esophagus going in from the back now. I'm not talking about pushing from the side yet, but going in from the back, if they're pushing down on the back of his neck, all the compression would happen in the esophagus. All these bony things here that don't compress would just go into the esophagus a little bit like that and compress it. You understand? It wouldn't compress something on the other side of something soft. It'd be like trying to play pool with a piece of rope, okay? Instead of a pool cue where everything's rigid pushing on the ball. All right. Okay. And I've already talked about pushing in from the side and trying to compress something in the front here. That doesn't make any sense either. So if the knee varied from the back to this side of the sternocleidomastoid, it's never going to compress something in the front of the neck. It's not going to do it. It's not in the right place. All right. So I would also ask the pulmonologist to go over the diaphragm anatomy like I did for the jury. And then he would see that where that left wrist was being pushed into the patient, into the George Floyd's back, wasn't anywhere near where the diaphragm moves. You know, below the diaphragm is abdomen. So you're talking about anything that's above the diaphragm being the thorax, okay? All right. Except for the lungs hanging over the edge of the periphery of the diaphragm a little bit. Okay, then I would ask him, let's go over the handcuffs in combination with the street together, impeding his breathing. Let's see that. And then I would, if I were the defense attorney, I would bring up the point that he's pushing on his back too low and you can't compress the back there anyway. It's hard as a rock. Can't be done. And I'd ask the whole jury to push on their lower back like that. And it certainly isn't going to affect something from the nipple and above. This makes no sense. All right. How could the AP, which means anterior posterior, which is the pump handle part, and the lateral movement of the chest, which is the bucket handle, how could those movements be affected by the handcuffs when they're not even resting over the thorax? Now, I put in this part about abdominal breathing because he completely left that out. That's a very big part of the way people breathe, believe it or not. If you don't believe me, when you're not looking sometime, reach down and feel your abdomen, even if you're in real good shape. I mean, if you have a washboard stomach, this applies, but men especially, their abdomen will go out a little bit, okay, when they inhale. when the air goes in, one way to make the volume larger in your chest and have the air go in, because of what I just told you about the pressure difference, is to push your stomach out a little bit. You see it on little kids a lot that are not self-conscious at all, and you see it on men who aren't as self-conscious as women. Women tend to breathe more with their thorax than men, okay? We can look at this, belly out, air goes in. Belly in, air goes out, okay? So I would ask him about that. Also, please explain frostbitten phrenic. The phrenic nerve is the nerve from C2, C3, and C4 that innervates the diaphragm. And it lays right over the pericardium on the way down to the diaphragm. And I would ask him to explain that to the jury, because when we do heart surgery and we put cardioplegia in to stop the heart from beating. Remember, plegia means paralyzed, like a quadriplegic or a paraplegic. We put a solution into the heart to stop it bleeding, and we make it real cold too, okay? So that it slows the metabolism down when it's not getting any oxygen, so it doesn't get damaged as bad. Since the phrenic nerve is laying right on the pericardium, we're dumping all this crushed ice in there to cool it off, to lower its metabolism and so forth. The phrenic nerve can get frostbitten a little bit, can get real cold and not work. So when the patient, when we're done with the surgery and we've started the heart again and closed everything up, sometimes the patient can't move their diaphragm to breathe because we've injured the phrenic nerve, not permanently, but we've made it so cold that it can't wake up and start working again. So how do people breathe when there's a frostbitten phrenic? Okay, how do you make your chest get bigger and smaller when you can't move, the diaphragm can't contract? Okay, and that's part and parcel to all of this. It's real important to really understand this, all of the strange things that can happen too, because I hate to say it, but there's a little bit of pulling one over on you with all this talk that we heard last night. And it's very surprising to see it, because I mean, I've clearly made some points here that are irrefutable. I mean, the left wrist is way below the chest and it doesn't even move down there anyway. How could that affect his chest? Equal to a surgeon cutting out the left lung? I mean, you know, just incredible. And the people just bought it, thought it was great. All the pundits said, oh, it was such a great testimony. I'm thinking, are you kidding? All right. Now, here's another thing. So let's get back to the fentanyl, because something killed him. I'm trying to make a point that his chest was not impinged on very much. If you're just pushing down 2 inches above his belt and on his neck up here, nothing was pushing on the chest, almost. And I know there were times when I think Chauvin put his knee up on his chest, maybe, or one of the other guys did. I mean, I didn't see it much because the car was in the way, but I'll tell you, from what I've heard from everybody so far, Chauvin's right knee, and even the pulmonologist said that, was pushed into the side of his chest. And the other officer had his leg straddling Floyd and was pushing with his two hands down on his left wrist, which is Mickey Mouse pressure on his back when it's rock solid like that. So there wasn't a whole lot of pressure on his chest, believe it or not. And this is a big guy now. All right. But I looked at the autopsy again because I wanted to look at what, I know that when you die of an overdose of fentanyl, I already talked about how your respiration slowed down, but you end up with pulmonary edema. We end up with fluid in your lungs. So I wanted to check with the autopsy to see if there was fluid in the patient's lungs. And lo and behold, here's what the autopsy states. The pulmonary parenchyma, the parenchyma is the lung tissue itself, is diffusely congested and edematous. Edema means there's water. You know, edema fluid is water. You know, physiological water. It's not water, but it's liquid. And it's in there in his lung parenchyma, just exactly like it says when you die of a fentanyl overdose. So I would ask the pulmonologist, is it true that in death by fentanyl overdose, the pulmonary parenchyma is edematous at autopsy? And he would have to say yes. And if he didn't, I'd say, well, according to this description in this textbook, it is. But anyway, he would probably say yes, he knows that. Is it also true that frothy white material appears at the overdose patient's mouth? That's another sign of fentanyl overdose. They have kind of a frothy white material that comes out of their mouth. And of course, I remember the testimony from the older man, the older gentleman that was on the street trying to tell him, don't fight him, you know, and so forth, which was damn good advice. It's a shame he fought being arrested and resisted being arrested like this. Every one of these cases arises out of people not fighting it out downtown at the station, fighting it out on the street where terrible things can happen because everybody's scared and everybody's on edge and there's weapons everywhere. You got to just do what the police say and go into the station and fight it out there. All right. But anyway, the old man was telling him that. The old man also said during his testimony, he saw foam around Floyd's mouth, exactly like the list of the things that happen when you get a fentanyl overdose. You have white frothy foam coming out of your mouth. And that's was seen in Floyd's mouth also. So for the pulmonologist just to snicker when people said, could it have been a fentanyl overdose? And he laughed and smiled and snickered. Boy, there's an awful lot of evidence that it was a fentanyl overdose. He drifted off. He had white foamy stuff coming out of his mouth. His lungs were filled with fluid. He had a significant amount of fentanyl in his toxicology report, in his bloodstream. I'll tell you, it certainly could have been a little bit of both, but it certainly was partly fentanyl, in my opinion. Gosh, I can't think of, the evidence is overwhelming almost. All right. So let's just get to the end of this now. An easy way to disprove this, when the pulmonologist said what Mr. Floyd went through would have killed a healthy man who was not taking drugs. Now, of course, he means a healthy man similar to Mr. Floyd in body habitus and height and weight and so forth, but not taking drugs, a healthy man. The pulmonologist said it would have killed someone like that. I'll tell you, if they got a 6'4" guy that looks like this, with this musculature in his shoulder girdle and his neck with his trapezius that big and chest this big. I mean, I showed you that the lungs do not go as far down as most people think. That's why we got the surgery resident sticking the tube through the liver. And the attendings, the pulmonologist attendings do it too, or have done it in my experience. But so the lungs aren't that far down, but I'll tell you, in a guy like George Floyd, they're really deep. He has enormous lung volume, a guy like this. Look at this chest here. And the musculature and everything. So if you get a guy like him that's healthy and not on drugs, and you put pressure on his neck the same way that Chauvin did, and you put him in handcuffs and push on his lower back here with his left wrist, which is here, like happened in the case, in the video, the pulmonologist said that person would die too. And I'm talking about a guy that is 5'9", 140 pounds. And I don't know what the other two guys weighed, but they didn't weigh much more. They're small, real tiny guys too, very small. You put those three guys on a healthy person that's not taking drugs, in my opinion, he would not die from this. I mean, you could do this experiment really easily under controlled conditions. You could follow that video to the hilt perfectly, have the knee exactly in the right place the whole time, and have a guy there that basically memorizes the video, run the video at the same time, and make sure that the person on top of the subject that we're going to use in the experiment puts his knee in just the same place with the same weight on him. But you got to make him weigh the same as Chauvin, and you got to make the other officers weigh the same, and you got to push the wrist down in the same place, turn the subject's head to the right like Mr. Floyd's head was turned. And I'll tell you, in my opinion, there's no way he would die from that. Not a big guy like this. There's just no way you can impinge on him. Look at the musculature back here. You can't compress something that's way in the front of his neck by pushing on the back there. I mean, you might be able to do it with Granny, but not him. All right. So that would be a solution to all this. You'd get to the conclusion very quickly if someone was willing to do that. And you could do it under controlled situations where it's not that dangerous. You know, if the guy starts to fizz out, you stop it immediately and you say, you win. Okay. So has science been co-opted by politics and special interest groups and corporations? Yes. And I've showed examples of this in other videos where people said 2 + 2 = 4. So it can't equal 4. 2 + 2 can equal 4 with COVID because 2 + 2 = 4. And this virus that's very similar to COVID. That's how, like, they were totally trying to pull one over on who was listening. It's just incredible. All right, but we got to stop this because science cannot be political. Other countries are going to eat our lunch if we keep doing this. It's just ridiculous. We ought to be able to do science without fudging the data to satisfy a political agenda or a corporation that's paying money to the people that are reporting the data, et cetera. It's horrible. All right, we're all done for tonight. It was long and I'm sorry, but hopefully I went over half of what that pulmonologist said in his testimony. I'll be glad to do the other half if people are interested in this. Of course, I got shadow banned. So I only got 200 views on my last one. So if you do get to see it, when I post this thing tonight, please make a comment or something, or vote a thumbs up or subscribe or something so I know that someone actually saw it. I got about 5 comments last time. Normally I get 500 comments. I mean, I get a lot of comments and I only got 5 on my last video and there were only 200 views. So they're definitely blocking me now. Horrible. All right, well, anyway, I've got tons of videos if they're still there. Some people said, hey, some of your videos aren't there anymore. So they're starting to pluck my videos off of YouTube also. Very upsetting. But you can see them and look at other things. There's a lot of things on there that aren't COVID too. A lot about art and surgery and everything. So thank you for watching. Again, I'll put my Patreon page link. And if you can go to Patreon, you will be able to see all these videos. And also I will try to put them on another platform so that they can't be taken down or I can't be shadow banned. And then I'll start referring everyone to that. But for now, let's keep going with this and try to get these things shown because they do offer a point of view that people need to see. There's so much nonsense going on. Real scientists trying to pull one over on the public, you know, because maybe they don't have the background. But that's not fair and that's not good either. So anyway, thank you very much for watching and I'll see you down the road. Thank you.